Okay, in this video, the learning target I'm going to talk about is I can simplify complex numbers or simplifying complex numbers, which use imaginary numbers. So the imaginary unit I equals the square root of -1. Remember that the square root of -1 is an imaginary number because square roots ask us what number squared equals the number underneath the square root, which in this case is -1. Well, when you square a number, you can't get a negative number. The reason for this is, let's suppose for a second that this number that I don't know is -1. Well, squaring a negative number would mean that I'm taking a negative times a negative. But if I took a negative times a negative, that would equal a positive, right? And if this number was positive, well, a positive times a positive also gives me a positive. So because there's no way to get a -1, this square root of -1 is known as the imaginary unit I. Now, what's kind of weird about the imaginary unit I is that if you square the imaginary unit I, you actually get -1. You get a real number. So to show you why that works, I is really the same thing as the square root of -1, right? And if I take the square root of -1 and I square it, squares and square roots cancel, leaving me with the number underneath, which is -1. So there's two things we need to know. I, which is equal to the square root of -1, is the imaginary unit. And when you take I squared, if you ever get an I squared, that simplifies to be -1. All right, let's go ahead and look at some examples of these. So when we look at these examples, it's a lot like combining like terms. So I have 2 plus 5i minus -5 plus 7i. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute this negative into the second parentheses. Okay, so in the first parentheses, well, that's just 2 plus 5i. But if I distribute the negative, it's just going to switch the signs, right? This -5, if I distribute a negative to it, will now be +5. And the +7, when I distribute the negative to it, will now be -7i. Okay. Once I've done that, now I'm just combining the like terms. So I'm going to take the imaginary parts and put those together. So 5i minus 7i is -2i, and 2 plus 5 is 7. So my final answer is 7 minus 2i. Okay. Let's look at another example here. So if I look at number 2, here I have -4i, and I'm multiplying that to 2i minus 3. So because I'm multiplying, I'm going to take this outside part and I'm just going to distribute it into the parentheses. So -4 times 2, well, that's -8, and I times I is I squared. Then -4 times -3 is +12, and then that's going to give me +12i. Now, normally we're used to being done here, okay? This is what's a little bit different with imaginary numbers, is once again, you need to remember that I squared is equal to -1, so I can actually simplify this a little bit further. I know that the I squared here is really a -1, so I have -8 times -1 plus 12i, and -8 times -1 is really +8. So I get 8 plus 12i as the simplified form. Okay, so there's just kind of an extra step with imaginary numbers. You need to remember that the I squared simplifies to be -1, and then you can multiply those two together. All right, let's go ahead and look at a few more examples here. So in number 3, I'm taking 7i minus 3 times 3i plus 6. So remember, I can kind of just multiply these together by distributing. So 7i times 3i, well, that's 21i squared. 7i times 6, well, that's going to give me 42i. And then if I take -3 times 3i, that's -9i. And then -3 times 6 is -18. And then once again, I want to combine the like terms. So I'm going to get 21i squared plus, if I take 42 minus 9, that's 33i minus 18. And then normally if these were x's, we're done, right? But remember once again that anytime you have an I squared like this, that's really a -1. So we get 21 times -1 plus 33i minus 18. and 21 times negative 1 is negative 21 plus 33i minus 18. And then notice I have two numbers now that I can combine, so I need to combine those numbers as well. If I take negative 21 minus 18 more, that's going to give me negative 39 plus 33i. Okay, so it's just like what you're used to doing. The only step with imaginaries that's different is the step here where you're taking an I squared and simplifying it to be negative 1. All right, the last example then, number 4 here. If I distribute the I, I'm going to get negative 3i squared. Then I'm going to get I times negative 1. Well, that's negative 1i. Negative 5 times negative 3i is positive 15i. And then negative 5 times negative 1 is positive 5. Once again, I know I squared is negative 1. So I'm going to get negative 1 times negative 3. If I combine these two, well, negative 1 plus 15 is going to be 14i plus 5. And then once again, I need to multiply these two together. So I'm going to get 3 plus 14i plus 5. And then the like terms, the 3 and the 5 can get put together. So I'm going to get 8 plus 14i as my final answer. Okay, so once again, when you're doing this, whether you're subtracting, adding, multiplying, it's the same thing that you're used to when you're dealing with x's. The only difference with imaginaries is you need to remember that you can simplify an I squared because I squared equals negative 1.